Welcome to Sonara's Deep Dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're not just looking at history in the usual sense. We're trying to peer into the spiritual architecture of North Africa. I mean, this region, the Maghreb, it's so often just boiled down to textbook narratives, isn't it? Punic Wars, Roman provinces, Vandal invasions.
Right, a list of conquerors.
Exactly. But underneath all of that political noise, there's this profound crucible of ancient, enduring spiritual beliefs. We're really talking about the persistence of the sacred.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive. We're trying to move past the military history, past the colonial accounts, and focus purely on the esoteric.
The whispers of the old gods.
Yes, the whispers of the ancient Berber gods, the power that people felt was held in caves and mountains, and these deep mystical practices that were already ancient when Carthage was just getting started.
So the sources we're looking at, they almost provide a kind of spiritual map linking these indigenous beliefs with the much more complex, sometimes unsettling occult traditions coming out of Carthage and Egypt.
That's a perfect way to put it. We're really trying to seek out the knowledge that exists outside the official histories, the sacred atmosphere, the deep earth magic, the little rituals of protection and power.
And this complexity is really what defines North Africa. I mean, you see this constant evolution, these what you call cultural marriages that just completely defy political borders.
They absolutely do. When you look at the spiritual history here, you realize that the local gods, they never really left.
Right.
They just found new vessels for their power.
Yeah.
They're either absorbed or they adapted or they subtly influenced the big global faiths that came in later.
So our deep dive today is a quest, really, to understand the mechanics of that spiritual resilience.
Exactly.
I think the best way in is probably to go chronologically. Before the Phoenicians, before the Romans, before all the subsequent monotheisms, what was the foundational faith? To really see how deep these roots go, we have to strip away the empires and just look at the bare earth, the elemental core of the indigenous belief system. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, when we talk about the indigenous Amazigh or Berber peoples, their earliest belief system was profoundly polytheistic. But not in the way you might think of the Greek or Roman pantheon.
Not a Mount Olympus situation.
No, not at all. It was focused on forces of nature, on deities that were born directly from the environment itself.
So completely rooted in the specific demands of the North African landscape, not imported.
Exactly.
So what were the big ones, the predominant forces they needed to appease or petition?
It was celestial and elemental. So, for instance, in Algerian Berber tradition, two figures really stand out. Ayyur, who is the god of the moon, and Anzar, the god of rain.
Rain, that makes perfect sense.
Of course. These are deities of absolute necessity for survival, especially in arid lands. Anzar was incredibly critical, and the rituals that were associated with him, they often involved a local girl, symbolizing fertility and rain, and the whole point was to ensure a good harvest.
It really speaks to this intense preoccupation with water, with sustenance, but then you have the other side of that coin, the sun, which can be life-giving, but also incredibly harsh. Was there a sun cult?
There's very compelling evidence. For one, yes, it's a linguistic analogy, mainly rooted in oral tradition, but it's supported by geography. The tradition suggests a sun god they called Kush.
Kush.
And the name Marrakesh itself, in Amazigh, it's Mauri Kush, is thought to mean the land of God, or more specifically, the land of Kush.
Wow. So the name of the city itself is a monument to this ancient god.
It seems so. And while, archaeological proof is harder to pin down than, say, finding a temple to Zeus, the linguistic survival suggests this solar deity was significant enough to permanently mark the land itself.
But beyond these big celestial deities, what seems to really distinguish Berber spirituality is the focus on localized power, the energy that's inherent in a specific spring or a mountain peak.
That is the absolute core of their mysticism. In huge regions like Morocco and Algeria, and especially among the Tuareg, the belief in and the worship of Jinni.
The spirits.
The powerful spirits that are associated with mountains, with stones, caves, springs. That belief was, and in some places, remains incredibly profound.
And this isn't just animism, is it? It's more specific than that.
It's more than that. It's a recognition that the landscape is inherently alive, that it's often dangerous, and that it holds an immense spiritual power that you have to honor and navigate very carefully.
So the mountain isn't just the place where a god lives, right? The mountain is the deity, or at least it's a highly potent spiritual entity in its own right.
Precisely. And that meant that specific natural features served as, well, as natural sanctuaries. Indigenous cults that involved the veneration of caves and sacred stones persisted for centuries.
I mean, they easily survived the Punic era and flourished well into the Roman period and beyond. That resilience is it's astonishing.
It really is. And we even know some of the names from Roman-era inscriptions. Deities like the Mauri, Maghreb, Ifru, Mona, and Bakaks.
Okay, listing the names is helpful, but what do we know about their function? Were they just generic protectors, or did they have specific mystical jobs?
Oh, they were highly specific and very localized. The Mauri, which literally means the Moorish gods, were a kind of collective of local deities.
Territorial protectors.
Probably territorial protectors, yeah. And they were still getting worship late into the 3rd century A.D. Ifru, or sometimes Ifrus, was a really key indigenous divinity, often associated with caves and protection.
So maybe an earth god or linked to the underworld?
That's the thinking. Perhaps a protector of springs, or even tribal hearths. Bakaks might have been a local version of a wine or fertility god, a kind of indigenous answer to Bacchus, but with much deeper local roots.
The key thing, then, is that they were tied to fertility, to resources like water, and to the guardianship of specific tribal lands.
That's the essence of it.
And this whole framework wasn't just isolated, was it? It was looking both east to the Mediterranean, but also west to the Atlantic. You mentioned this intriguing theory linking it all to the Atlantic Bronze Age.
That link is so important because it's a reminder that North Africa was part of this vast pre-Mediterranean trade system.
Yeah.
The spiritual parallels you can find all along the Atlantic coast suggest a kind of shared substratum of belief.
Tell us about that comparison again, the one between the Basque goddess and the Irish figure. It's speculative, I know, but it's so compelling.
It is. It connects Morocco to Western Europe through these extensive Bronze Age trade routes. So if you look at the Basque goddess Mauri, she is very strongly associated with caves and with cattle.
Fertility and Cothic power from the earth.
Exactly. Now look across the water to the Irish figure Meb, Queen of Connacht. She's famous for her cattle raids, and she's also intrinsically linked to caves, which were often seen as entrances to the underworld.
So you've got a network stretching thousands of miles. Ireland, Spain, Morocco, all sharing this core set of concepts. Caves as sacred portals, and cattle as a symbol of wealth and maybe a sacred offering.
Yes. And the spiritual significance of this is that it suggests the early Berber religious framework was fundamentally centered on the deep earth, on these chthonic powers, and on agrarian and animal fertility.
Which isn't so different from the earliest European beliefs.
Not at all. And it suggests that the association of the Basque Mauri with cattle and caves might be a much purer analogy for the local Amazigh goddess than, say, the later Roman attempts to just call her Isis.
Right. It points to a spiritual heritage that's deeper, more elemental, and connected to the land in a way that just transcends the later imperial religious systems.
What's really striking is that even when these massive, sophisticated empires arrived, that fundamental reverence for the earth, the mountain as a genie, the cave as a sanctuary, that never faltered.
It was this intense, visceral connection to the land that really set the stage for everything that came after.
It did. And this profound connection meant that any foreign cult that came in, be it Punic, Roman, or eventually Islamic, it had to grapple with this existing, powerful, elemental energy. It couldn't just replace the indigenous gods. It had to absorb them or merge with them. That resilience is really the defining feature of North African mysticism.
Okay, so that grounded, elemental spirituality provides such a sharp contrast as we move into Carthage, this massive cosmopolitan metropolis.
A completely different world.
The Carthaginians, they inherited their faith from the Phoenicians, and they brought this organized, sophisticated, and frankly, sometimes deeply disturbing ritual practice into this environment. This is where it gets really interesting because we have to dive into the Tafet.
The Tafet it's absolutely central to Punic spiritual life, but also to its lasting notoriety. And what's crucial is its location extramuros outside the city walls.
Which immediately tells you something.
It suggests an intense, liminal, sacred site. Something separated from the profane, day-to-day life of the city. And this site, active from the city's earliest days in the 8th century BC, it really defined Carthaginian identity and their whole relationship with the divine.
So describe the ritual function. What was physically happening there that made it so unique and so controversial?
It was, at its core, a dedicated burial ground. but one containing thousands upon thousands of urns.
And inside these urns?
Inside were the cremated remains of infants and/or small animals, like sheep or fowl. The urns themselves were often carefully sealed, placed within protective pottery. They weren't meant to be disturbed. They were offerings, dedications to the gods, seeking protection and divine favor.
And then above these urns were the monuments. Can you clarify the different types of markers they used? I know they evolved over time.
They did. In the earliest phases, the markers were very simple, just monoliths or smooth river stones. Later, they started using sipi.
Which are like simple columns.
Simple stone columns or square pillars, yeah, often used as boundary markers or memorials. But then, from the 4th century BC onward, you start seeing inscribed stelae.
And a stela is much more elaborate.
Much more. It's a stone slab or a column that's inscribed or sculpted with votive prayers and ritual emblems, all dedicated to the two main deities of the site, Baal-Hamon and Tanit. So the monuments evolved from just simple markers to these complex theological statements.
And the ground itself was just layered, wasn't it?
Right.
Showing centuries of continuous use.
Absolutely. The ground at the Tophet was constantly being worked, raised, reused as new generations performed the ritual. The sheer continuous dedication tells you that this was not some temporary response to a crisis.
It's fundamental.
It was a foundational, essential part of their religious practice.
Yeah.
And it spanned the entire lifetime of the empire.
Okay, we have to address the controversy. The historical accounts, which were so often fueled by Roman hostility, paint this site as a place of horrific child sacrifice. You know, Molech worship. What's the key theological insight that the archaeology can offer that gets us beyond that simple cemetery versus sacrifice debate?
I think the key is not to view it as just a cemetery. While some researchers do argue it was for children who died naturally, too young to be part of society, there's definitive evidence of combined remains that forces a much deeper look.
You're talking about the urn from Leyden.
I am. There's an urn dating to the 6th or 5th century BC, held in the Leyden Museum, that contains the cremated remains of a newborn baby and a lamb, together.
And what does that mixing of remains tell you? What does it signify?
It points very strongly towards substitution, towards proxy sacrifice.
So the idea being?
Well, if the intention was to offer the best or the firstborn, a concept that's very common in ancient Near Eastern religions, but you also want to avoid, continuously destroying your own community.
Right, that's not sustainable.
Not at all. Then offering an animal in place of or alongside the human could be this localized, incredibly intense plea for divine intervention. It speaks to a deeply anxious spiritual life, focused on appeasing powerful deities like Baal-Hamon to ensure the city's survival.
So it's a ritual dedicated to the fundamental survival of the community, and it's enacted through this high-stakes dedication of the unformed, whether that's human or animal.
Precisely. It's an intense form of ritual magic, rooted in propitiation, in foundation, and in protection. And that spiritual intent is captured visually by the mystical symbolism on the stelae.
Let's focus on those symbols because that's the direct visual language of their mysticism. What are the key emblems we see over and over?
They are, for the most part, aniconic, so abstract rather than figurative, which suggests an earlier, maybe pure mystical tradition before the later Greek influence came in.
Okay.
The most frequent symbols are the sun disk, which represents Baal-Hamon, the star, to the goddess Astarte, and of course the famous sign of Tanit.
The sign of Tanit. It's such a strange, beautiful symbol. It looks like a little stick figure with its arms up.
It does. A stylized female figure with a triangular body, a circle for a head, and two outstretched arms.
What is the occult meaning there? What is it representing?
It's often interpreted as a kind of cosmic symbol representing the goddess as a protective genius or daemon of the Carthaginians. The arms are raised in a gesture of blessing or protection, almost encompassing the worshiper.
So it's an abstract representation of the sacred feminine.
Yes, of the cosmic womb, symbolizing fertility, protection, and maybe the gateway to the afterlife. All highly relevant functions for a goddess whose cult absolutely dominated the Tophet.
And then there's the other really enigmatic symbol, the bottle idol. What are the theories about that strange motif?
The bottle idol is fascinating because it's so abstract.
Yeah.
The general consensus is that it represents a vessel, maybe a container for liquid offerings like oil or wine, symbolizing libations.
Okay, that's the practical interpretation.
That's the practical one. But on a deeper, more esoteric level, it's been theorized that it might represent the human soul or the spirit, the vessel of life itself. Its appearance on these funerary stelae suggests it could be a visual metaphor for the dedication of the spirit, or the essence of the life that was being offered at the Tophet. It just adds another layer of this quiet, powerful symbolism to the site.
And this practice, this whole ritual complex, wasn't just confined to the city of Carthage itself. It spread.
It did, which demonstrates its deep resonance across North Africa. The Numidian peoples, they adopted Punic cults, and they built their own Tophets dedicated to Baal-Hamon in these inland cities like Maktaris, Sirta, and Alphibaros.
But did they just copy it, or did they adapt it?
They adapted it. Even though their iconography sometimes incorporated local Numidian features, the core ritual practice and the use of Punic or Neo-Punic inscriptions confirm the lasting influence of the Carthaginian system.
And the Tophet cult even survived the fall of Carthage.
It did. It remained widespread until the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. That longevity, it just proves how deeply ingrained this high-stakes ritual was in the entire regional spiritual landscape.
That longevity really underlines a broader point, doesn't it? That Carthage was this massive spiritual nexus.
A hub.
Its trade routes weren't just bringing in timber and metals. They were importing entire sophisticated magical and esoteric systems, especially from Egypt, and then merging them with these local traditions.
That's the key. The merging.
So let's start with the big gods, the ones they inherited from Phoenicia and then adapted for themselves.
Okay, so the pivotal link to the mother city, Tyre, was the god Melkart. His name means king of the city, and he was a god of both the sea and the underworld.
The perfect god for a trade empire.
Absolutely. And an empire built on maritime superiority, a god of the sea, the dead, was essential for securing safe voyages and, protection across the Mediterranean.
And then you have the real power couple of the Punic pantheon, Baal-Hamon and Tanit.
Baal-Hamon was the powerful chief deity. He's often associated with the sun and identified with the great sky gods of other cultures, like Zeus or the Egyptian Amun-Re.
And his consort, Tanit, she functioned as the city's protective spirit, its daemon.
She did, and her syncretism is a perfect example of this spiritual adaptation we're talking about. After a major military defeat in 396 BC, a religious change was implemented. They imported the cult of Demeter and Kor from the Greeks.
Why them specifically? Was it an attempt to sort of absorb the religious power of their Greek enemies?
It seems that way. The defeat was devastating, and the Carthaginian elite clearly felt their main gods had failed them. So, importing the Demeter-Kor cult goddesses of the harvest and the underworld cycle allowed them to ritually absorb that Greek spiritual power.
So they weren't rejecting Tanit.
Not at all. They were augmenting her power to include these new necessary elements of protection and fertility. They syncretized her with Demeter.
This cultural blending, this openness, it must have meant that highly specialized Egyptian magical practices found a huge demand in Carthage. We have to talk about amulets.
The use of amulets is the most immediate, visible sign of Egyptian religious and magical influence. And these weren't just, decorative objects. They were practical tools.
Tools for ceremonial magic.
Yes, intended primarily to protect individuals, both living and dead, from specific evils, from diseases, or from demonic forces. They were like portable, personalized wards against chaos.
And they were either imported directly from Egypt or copied locally. What does the quality of the Punic copies tell us about their priorities?
The Punic imitations, well, they were often made from less durable materials like soft soapstone, and they were characterized by this really rudimentary execution. Stylistically distorted features compared to the Egyptian originals.
So they weren't great artists?
It's not that. It suggests that for the local Carthaginian artisan and for the consumer, the magical function, the specific power inherent in the form of the amulet, like the Ujat Eye or the Ankh, was far more important than the artistic precision.
It was about channeling the energy.
It was about channeling the protective energy, not about replicating the artistic detail perfectly.
Scarabs are another major piece of Egyptian religious magic that found this kind of double life in Carthage.
Absolutely. The scarab beetle, which symbolizes Khepri, the rising sun and renewal, it represented the afterlife in Egypt. So naturally, they were used heavily in Punic funerals to ensure safe passage for the dead.
But then they make this incredible leap into civic life.
That's what's so fascinating. Scarabs were used as seals by administrative bodies, often by high priests, to authenticate documents, contracts, legal agreements.
Hold on, so a symbol designed to help a dead person get to the afterlife was also used to sign a trade contract. That is a powerful blending of the sacred and the profane.
It shows just how pervasive ritual was. The spiritual power of the scarab wasn't just kept in the necropolis. It was actively channeled into daily, civic, and commercial life to give authority and validation to written agreements.
And this leads us to maybe the most ancient and profound occult connection, the one involving a pharaoh from 1,000 years earlier.
Yes.
Tell us about the seals found in that sanctuary archive, the ones that point to Thutmose III.
It is an incredible find. During the final destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, a large sanctuary archive containing over 3,600 clay seals was burned.
And many of them bore this one pharaoh's name.
About half of them, yes.
Yeah.
They bore the name of the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III. His throne name was Menkaure, and he lived in the 15th century BC. He was this towering figure, a master warrior, an empire builder, and his name was treated almost like a cryptogram of divine power.
How was the name interpreted magically by the Carthaginian priests? What was the connection they were making?
The name, Menkaure, was cryptographically linked by Punic priests to Amun-Re, the great Egyptian sun god. These seals likely belonged to the temple and were used by the priesthood to authenticate temple contracts and offerings.
So this is key. It wasn't just about using an old, famous name.
No, it was about ritually channeling the authority of the oldest, most powerful sun cult in the Mediterranean, Amun-Re, and linking it directly to Carthage's own main sun deity, Baal-Hamon. Its high-level esoteric channeling being applied to civic administration.
So in using that seal, a priest wasn't just signing a document. They were actively invoking the authority of a 1,000-year-old deity to sanctify the transaction.
Precisely. It demonstrates a deep and ritualistic understanding of Egyptian magic, not just a superficial borrowing of artifacts. And you see this same blending of powerful protective energy in their iconography, specifically with the lion-headed goddess.
Right, the statue, sometimes called Tinasut from the 1st century AD, it's fierce, it's formidable.
It is. This figure, a goddess with the head of a lion, is an unmistakable echo of Egyptian influence. Now, while some people tried to retroactively identify her as a figurative version of Tanit, she almost certainly recalls the Thebe Egyptian lioness goddess, Sekhmet.
The goddess of war, plague, and healing.
Exactly. Sekhmet was known for her dual nature. She could bring pestilence, but she also had the power to heal it.
That duality, that idea of the terrifying protector, it seems to really embody the brutal landscape of North Africa and the complex spiritual needs of the people there.
It really does. It suggests that imported gods were only successful if they could tap into that deep elemental power and respond to the local need for ferocious protection. She symbolizes the syncretic spiritual necessity of a powerful zoomorphic divinity protecting the land.
So Carthage was fundamentally defined by its ability to import, to integrate, and to create this unique occult system focused on securing safety, channeling solar power, and guaranteeing prosperity through complex ritual action.
Yes, that's a perfect summary.
Okay, so the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC was physical. It was total. But what we've established is that the spiritual life it fostered, the elemental worship, the Tufit rites, the Egyptian magic, it just went deeper into the soil.
It didn't vanish.
So what does this all mean for the great religions that came later, for Christianity, for Islam? How did this ancient spiritual energy adapt? So what does this all mean?
It means we have to recognize the incredible indigenous resilience of the Amazigh people. The spiritual threads that were woven by the local populations, they never broke. The fundamental practices, the worship of mountains, caves, sacred stones, they persisted through centuries of Punic, Roman, and later Vandal and Byzantine rule.
That local, intimate reverence for the landscape remained the constant.
It was the constant. We have hard evidence of this continuity. The local cults didn't just vanish. They may have become less public, but they were still there.
Like the Mauri and Ifru.
Exactly, the indigenous protectors and earth gods. They continued to be worshipped well into the Roman imperial era. And beyond that, local burial customs, like building monumental graves and these specific Hellenistic-style Numidian graves, they survived despite centuries of Carthaginian cultural domination.
Which shows a deep-seated desire to maintain a unique spiritual and cultural identity.
A unique Libyan-Numidian identity, yes, focused on reverence for ancestors and the structure of the afterlife.
And this whole environment of deep spiritual resilience led to what we've been calling cultural marriage, where beliefs crossed boundaries and adapted to fit into new religious vessels. So let's look at the monotheisms.
This is where North African faith gets its really unique flavor. You see elements of the Amazigh tradition influencing Judaism, for example. Claims of Amazigh Jewishness still persist, especially around artisan subcultures like the Tuareg myths. Now, while some of these claims can feel a bit like lost tribe fantasy, the historical intermingling is undeniable. It suggests an ancient and deep connection, where local spiritual practices became interwoven with Jewish tradition.
And then Christianity, which had its earliest and arguably its fiercest flowering right here in North Africa, how did that local spirit manifest there?
Very, very strongly. Many Amazigh were among the earliest Christians, and one of the major expressions of that was Arianism, which became a significant form of Christianity in the region.
And for our listener, just to be clear, Arianism was the theological position that held that Christ was created by God the Father and was therefore subordinate to him.
Right, not co-eternal, as Nicene Christianity held. This gave North African Christianity a unique theological flavor that was different from the Roman standard.
But beyond the high theology, there was this deeply indigenous expression of spiritual fervor that often put it at odds with Rome, the Donatist movement.
The Donatists are such a vital piece of this puzzle. This was a fierce, uniquely North African Christian movement in the 4th and 5th centuries. They split from the rest of the church, mainly over issues of purity and spiritual integrity.
Specifically regarding clergy who had collaborated with the Roman authorities during persecutions.
Precisely. They valued martyrdom, purity, and absolute spiritual commitment above all else. And that intensity, that uncompromising demand for spiritual authenticity. You can see it as a channeling of that ancient, fierce, indigenous spiritual energy.
The same energy that drove the intensity of the Tophet rituals.
Or the worship of a local protective genie. It's that local elemental ferocity meeting a new faith, and the result is a demand for absolute spiritual commitment.
It makes so much sense.
But maybe the most profound and lasting transformation happens with the arrival of Islam. When you look at later practices, particularly Sufi Islam and the widespread Maliki school of law, they are widely acknowledged to be largely inspired by pre-Islamic rites.
This is the ultimate example of old energies finding new, lasting vessels.
It is.
So how exactly did something like genie worship translate into Islamic practice? What are the concrete spiritual connections?
It manifested primarily through the veneration of marabouts. In North African Islam, a marabout is a holy man, often a Sufi saint or an ascetic, whose tomb becomes a sacred shrine, a zawiyah.
Right.
This practice of localized pilgrimage and intense veneration of a powerful individual at a specific sacred geographic site, often a hilltop or near a spring or in a cave, is a direct transformation of the ancient cult of the localized genie and those indigenous gods like Ifru.
So the place that was once sacred because of the earth spirit, it now becomes sacred because of the saint who is buried there. The spiritual mechanism is preserved.
The mechanism is preserved. The underlying belief system about the power of that localized sacred space remains. And what's more, many trance practices, certain ceremonial magic rituals, the use of amulets for protection, the reverence for specific trees or stones associated with a saint. These are all powerful survivals of pre-Islamic Berber rites, woven seamlessly into the fabric of local Islamic mysticism.
The indigenous faith wasn't defeated, it was incorporated.
It was incorporated. And that ability to blend and persist is just astonishing. The tensions we sometimes see today over identity, often framed as Berber versus Arab, it really misses this long history of deep blending where spiritual life was layered, complex, and persistent no matter who held political power.
It's like the land itself has a memory.
It does, even the language. The Neo-Punic script, which was an evolution of the Phoenician alphabet, continued to be used in North Africa until at least the 3rd century AD, long after Rome had conquered the land. The local culture fiercely maintained elements of its past wherever it could, spiritually, linguistically, and ritually.
The ultimate takeaway here, then, is that North Africa's spiritual life was defined by its resilience, its deep tie to the land, and this syncretic magic that was generated by centuries of trade and exchange. And when Carthage was physically destroyed, the spiritual and ritual life it embodied simply retreated back into the local environment, waiting to shape the next dominant culture that came along.
To synthesize our whole deep dive, North Africa's indigenous faith was intrinsically tied to the land. It prioritized elemental power and sacred geography through the worship of genie and local protector gods.
And Carthage took that foundation and just amplified it.
It amplified it through a rich, sophisticated magical tradition, especially imported Egyptian occultism, and focused it intensely on complex ritual, on symbolic reverence for protection with Tanit and Baal Hammon, and on securing the afterlife through sites like the Tophet.
That destruction of Carthage was a historical reality, but the spiritual and ritual life it fostered, it just remained deeply embedded. The persistence of the genie and Sufi saint worship, the deep-seated reverence for sacred geography, the demand for spiritual purity you see in movements like Donatism, It all ensured that the North African spiritual energy would always retain its unique, powerful, and fiercely indigenous flavor.
And that leads to a final provocative thought for you to consider. Building on the profound secrecy and ritual we discussed at the Tophet, the ancient sources sadly tell us that Carthage had a large literary oeuvre in Punic script that perished almost entirely with the city. The Romans, in their very pragmatic way, saw fit to preserve only one Punic book after the destruction, an agricultural treatise by a man named Mago.
Right, a farming manual. The rest, histories, treaties, philosophy, was just deemed unimportant, lost forever in the burning libraries of 146 BC.
So considering the immense power the priesthood held, the intensity of a ritual like the Tophet, and the high reliance on Egyptian magical systems for both civic administration and personal protection, how much of Carthage's vast, lost literary culture was focused not on the practicalities of farming or trade, but on preserving the specific secrets of ceremonial magic, of astrological calculations, and the precise esoteric structure of the spirit world?
A whole library of magic gone.
A vast, dark archive that even in its absence continues to influence the land centuries later.
Thanks for tuning into Sonara's Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future episodes. I bring you fresh content every week. Thanks for listening.